I would now like to introduce our speaker. Dr. James Roberts is a fish biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey in Fort Collins, Colorado. He has broad research expertise and investigates the ecological consequences of environmental stressors like climate change and eutrophication for aquatic systems and specifically fish populations. Currently, James is investigating the potential effects climate change may have on the persistence of cutthroat trout in stream and lake habitats throughout the southern Rocky Mountains. James's other current research activities include native fish conservation, contaminants in upper Colorado River native fish, mountain lake limnology, and biomonitoring of Rocky Mountain transition zone streams. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Mary. And I'd also like to thank everyone who is joining in on the WebEx today. I'm going to present some research that I started, this line of research which started back in 2010. What the results I'm going to show you today include multiple projects and multiple collaborators and co-authors. And so that list of the people that were instrumental to performing a lot of this work is shown on the first slide here. So I'd like to thank all those fine scientists as well. And today I'm going to, a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about today, start with how climate change is expected to influence trout in the West, and then move on to some of the work I've done for specific subspecies of cutthroat trout and how they may be influenced by climate change in the southern Rocky Mountains. So with climate change, we expect air temperature to increase. And this is a map showing the increase of mean annual air temperature from 1950 to 2009. If you focus in on the southern Rockies region here, you can see there's a lot of variation in that air temperature change, in those predicted or observed actually air temperature changes. But we're not just expecting changes in temperature, we're also expecting changes in hydroclimate. And models suggest more arid conditions, and some observed patterns are showing that that is being realized through increases in the timing of snowmelt runoff and peak discharges, and then lower base flow discharges later in the year. So the question of how climate change is going to influence trout in the West is not a new one. It was first tackled back in the mid-90s, and this is one of the first seminal studies that was, or sentinel studies that was done looking at how climate change may influence trout populations in the western U.S. So on the left, you have suitable habitat as they saw it in 1996, and then with a 3-degree increase in air temperature, they predicted a 50% habitat loss for trout. But this is for all trout, not any specific species, and it's across a quite wide range of habitats and species. So as we move forward in time, we came up with some more sophisticated ways to tackle this question. And this was a study that was published in 2011, which used not only air temperature, but also stream flow and then biotic interactions with other trout species to predict changes in trout habitat. And overall, this study predicted a similar result, that about 50% of the habitat in the West will be gone by 2080. But when you look at specific species, or you see that is a little bit different. So here we have cutthroat trout on the left. In the 2080s, is expected to suitable habitats expected to decrease by 58%, and brook trout, a non-native species in the West here, is expected to decrease by 77%. But when we're thinking about the southern Rocky Mountains and the cutthroat trout subspecies that are found there, we really want to have some more population-specific predictions and tools to look at how climate change may influence these populations. From these previous studies, we can make a few predictions about how we might expect climate change to influence cutthroat trout populations in the southern Rocky Mountain region. We have snowmelt-driven streams, so with increases in stream temperature, we might expect these populations to track to higher elevations as the lower elevation stream habitat becomes too warm. We also might expect a decrease in stream flow with that snow melting earlier in the year and potentially having isolated stream pools later in the base flow season, which might require fish to move downstream to follow this wave of water. And then we also have stochastic events such as drought, wildfire, and debris flows, which could influence these populations. And those are also expected to increase with climate change. We also have to take into account the ecological setting, and for the subspecies I'll be talking about today, that includes connectivity. What kind of habitat are these fish found in? How big is that habitat? Is it connected to just streams, multiple tributaries, streams and lakes? Those are all things we need to take into account. And then also, are there non-native species present? So who are the trout in the Southern Rocky Mountains? The first one I'll be talking about today and showing this figure is the Colorado River Cutthroat Trout. It's found in the upper Colorado River Basin. There are 3 subspecies found in the Southern Rocky Mountains. The second one is the Greenback Cutthroat Trout. This is found in the upper South Platte drainage, and I will be briefly touching on this subspecies towards the end of the talk. The other main subspecies that I'll be talking about today is the Rio Grande Cutthroat Trout, which is found in the Rio Grande basins and some eastern basins as well. I'll start with the Colorado River Cutthroat Trout. This is a map showing the distribution of conservation populations for this subspecies, shown in red here. Currently, it is inhabiting 14% of its historical habitat, and most of these populations are found in isolated headwater streams greater than 1,700 meters in elevation. And then here we have the distribution of populations by fragment size or length. So we have stream fragment length shown in kilometers here on the y-axis, and then just the frequency of populations falling into each of those length categories shown on the x-axis. And there are 309 of these populations. As you can see, the majority of them are smaller in fragment length, and the median length is actually 5.9 kilometers. And this is a good figure to keep in your mind as we go through this talk, because fragment length is an important measure of how these populations are going to be able to deal with climate change going into the future. So to predict the probability of persistence for Colorado River Cutthroat Trout, we created a Bayesian network model. And this is just a graphical representation of that model. Briefly, Bayesian network models are very useful for this type of analysis because you can include all kinds of different data with varying degrees of certainty or uncertainty. And to create these, you first have to create this directed acyclical graph or influence diagram, which identifies important nodes, how those nodes relate to each other, and then ultimately how they relate to your node of your terminal node or posterior probability. In this case, that's the probability of cutthroat trout population persistence. So in general, this model can be broken up into kind of 2 sections. The first one is temperature, and we have 2 measures of stream temperature. The first one is this maximum stream temperature, which is a shorter term measure, and then the second one is the warmest 30 days, which is a longer term measure. And I'll talk more about those differences and how those will influence these populations in the next slide. The second section is fragment length. As you can see here, stream fragment length is influencing population size and also how these populations are going to deal with stochastic effects, like I mentioned before, wildfire, drought, post-wildfire debris flows. And then these all funnel down into the probability of cutthroat trout persistence. We run this model for 2 future time horizons, 2040 and 2080, and the dynamic inputs to this model for those time periods include stream temperature, and we had to create a stream temperature model for the upper Colorado River Basin to do that, and this is based on dynamically downscaled climate projections. So I mentioned temperature was one component of this model, and that's the first thing a lot of people think about when you start talking about climate change. So we'll first go over the thermal criteria for cutthroat trout as we define them in this model. So for survival, is this water warm enough for Colorado River cutthroat trout to survive? And we found from reviewing the literature that these streams have to be less than 26 degrees Celsius to be considered suitable for survival. This is based on both lab and some field data. But we know that temperature influences more than just the survival of the fish. It also influences the recruitment and growth. And one interesting thing about these Colorado River cutthroat trout is they're found at very high elevations, like I mentioned before. And actually, some of these streams are too cold for consistent recruitment or survival of young-of-the-year fish. And so we use that longer-term measure of stream temperature, the M30 AT, to assess whether the habitat is thermally suitable for recruitment and growth. Growth is considered optimal between 9 and 18 degrees Celsius, and that is based on laboratory studies within 75% of the maximum growth rate for these fish. And then once it gets over 18, we start seeing declining growth up until we get to 20 degrees C, and then we have little or no growth. But in addition to temperature, we also included risk from fragmentation or small stream size. And one of those risks is genetic, and that's related to the population size of these cutthroat trout. And we were able to predict the size of these populations based on their fragment length from a study in 2005. And so we used that overall adult population and this ratio of effective to census population, which suggests that 25% of these fish are the effective population, and that meaning they are contributing unique genes into the gene pool. And to have the stream length that buffers you against any of this immediate negative genetic effects, short-term or long-term, we need to have a stream size of at least 7.7 kilometers to give you effective population size of greater than 500. And you can remember the median fragment size for these fish was below 6. The size of the fragment also influences how the populations will be able to deal with stochastic effects, which happen patchily within a basin. They include drying and freezing from drought and also wildfire and sediment. And one kind of landscape attribute we found to be very helpful in dealing with these types of disturbance events is the presence of bound alluvial valleys. And those are found about every 3.6 kilometers in Rocky Mountain streams. So we created 3 states here. If your population has less than 3.6 kilometers of stream length, you would probably be highly susceptible to some of these effects because you might not have any bound alluvial valleys. Between 3.6 and 7.2, you might have 1 to 2. We'd have some variable buffering, and then once you get over that 7.2 threshold, you'd have at least 2, probably more, bound alluvial valleys, giving you some more robust buffering against some of these stochastic effects. So as I mentioned before, to drive this model, we not only need stream fragment length, but also stream temperature at different time periods. And to do look at how stream temperature varied through time, we created a stream temperature model for the Upper Colorado River Basin for this application to Colorado River cutthroat trout. To do this, we found 483 stream temperature records throughout the basin. We used a suite of predictors which include both climate and landscape variables and a universal kriging technique. This model gave us a prediction error of 1.98 degrees Celsius, which is more than adequate and very similar to other regional stream temperature models. In summary, this model predicted a little more than a degree increase in that M30 AT stream temperature metric across the whole basin by 2080. However, in 2080, 86% of the segments where cutthroat trout are currently residing are still suitable. And that comes out to 823. And this map is just showing you how that temperature varies kind of with elevation, so you can follow some of these streams as they go from higher elevations where they're colder, shown in blue, to some warmer segments as they get further down in elevation. And then also those populations that are found in lower elevation portions of the Upper Colorado River Basin generally have warmer temperatures. So we have the stream temperature model, and we have our Bayesian network model. We can use those as input to our and come up with predictions of population persistence for Colorado River cutthroat trout. This is a map showing the spatial distribution of those persistent predictions. They're color-coded over here. Red is less than 50 or 0.5 probability of persistence, and then blue is greater than 0.9. So this is for current conditions, and you can see here in this histogram where we have probability on the X and proportion of populations falling into those probability categories on the Y. That a lot of these cutthroat trout, these Colorado River cutthroat trout, are giving a high prediction of persistent probability in the current thermal conditions. However, when we move to 2080, we apply that model and we get those new temperature metrics. We see some changes, but they're not as straightforward as you might expect. Some of these very long stream segments that contain cutthroat trout are still given a prediction of a high probability of persistence. However, these intermediate length ones shown less than 0.8 probability of persistence are kind of changing, and they're actually going in both ways. Some of these really high elevation intermediate lengths, so greater than 3.6 kilometers, are actually increasing in their probability of persistence in 2080, and that's because some of those streams are actually too cold for reproduction currently, and they're thermally actually getting better. But they have to be in the right amount of stream habitat to kind of get better and not come at risk of stochastic events. And overall, if we look at all these populations, we use a threshold of 0.9 probability of persistence in 2080. 62% of these populations are at risk. So even though it might look like a better picture here, there's still more than half of these populations are at risk in 2080 of extirpation. And we know it's not just stream temperature and fragment size that are influencing these populations. There are a lot of other stressors on these populations and a lot of other things that can threaten that fragment length, which I just showed is an important attribute for these populations. And one of those, which is especially prevalent for trout or native trout in the Southern Rocky Mountains, is non-native invasion. And that primarily happens via brook trout invasion in these headwater streams that contain Colorado River cutthroat trout. A lot of times these brook trout can be introduced in these cutthroat trout populations from barrier failure. At a lot of these cutthroat trout populations, there's actually a downstream barrier which should prevent exchange in the upstream direction from fish downstream, but sometimes there's barrier failures of these man-made barriers, and they can also be illegal introduction above these barriers. And once a brook trout is introduced into a cutthroat trout population, they can rapidly displace cutthroat trout. And we reviewed some detailed monitoring of greenback cutthroat trout, which I showed before, during its first 30 years of its recovery program, and we found that 8% of these populations are invaded by non-native fish per decade. And then also using some field studies of interactions between brook trout and cutthroat trout, we pulled from the literature, we found that these brook trout can move upstream and colonize very quickly, and that can actually reduce the fragment size of these Colorado River cutthroat trout by 1.5 kilometers per year. And we don't have any data on areas that are more prone to be invaded on the landscape. So to kind of stimulate this whole thing, we use these two rates of invasion, of how invasions happen and how they proceed once they do happen, and applied them randomly on the landscape. And so we ran 100 simulations of these invasions, and we did use a yearly time step from 2010 to 2080. And once a stream segment is invaded, we remove it, and then at those different time steps and recalculate the temperature for that fragment. And given all these results, and then we plug them back into the Bayesian network, so we have potentially a new temperature and also a new fragment length. and we can get new predictions of persistence for these populations. And on average, over these 100 simulations, we had 122 cutthroat trout populations that were extirpated, primarily due to non-native invasions. 5 were, on average, were partially invaded, and 182 were not invaded. And this is just a map showing one of those simulations. The extirpated populations are shown in red, and those are populations where cutthroat trout started at the downstream end of this population when it first invaded and was chosen randomly on the landscape, and then moved upstream, reducing that fragment length by 1.5 kilometers every year. So an extirpated population is one where that entire stream length was occupied by brook trout. And then blue ones are partially invaded, and green ones are not invaded. So just to illustrate this a little bit further, this is an example of one simulation and how it looks in space over time. So we use those rates of incidence and then also progression. And this one is just going to show you how the rate of incidence, so when an invasion occurs, not actually how it moves upstream, and how that looks through time on the landscape. So I'm starting in 2010, we're going to run this for 100 years. The first 10 steps will be yearly, and then it'll go by decade after that. So like I mentioned before, you can see these red streams popping up, and that's when one of these black Colorado River cutthroat trout populations gets invaded based on a simulation. And then when we go by decade, it gets more and more as we move through the end of this century. And in this simulation, 53% of these populations were invaded by 2110, so in 100 years. But how does this all relate back to population persistence? So here are our current results that I already showed you with no invasion. Those should look similar to the ones I showed you on the map before. And then when we include invasion, the biggest change we see is in the populations that are extirpated or given a 0% probability of persistence. So in 2040, 52 populations fall into that category, and in 2080, 122 fall into that category. So that's a pretty big difference from just looking at temperature and fragment length alone. It suggests that these non-native invasions are a significant stressor, and much more than maybe climate change could be a blow to wiping out these populations entirely. And if we look at that, the percent of these populations that are at risk, with no invasion, 62%, like I showed before, and when we include invasion, it's 76%. So a 14 percentage point increase, but again, the take home here is that 122 of these populations are actually predicted to be extirpated entirely. So moving on to other subspecies in the Southern Rocky Mountains, the Rio Grande Cutthroat trout, we attempted to do a similar analysis, create a Bayesian network model to look at the probability of persistence for this subspecies, which is actually the southernmost subspecies of cutthroat trout. Currently, it's found in 11% of its historical habitat. The conservation populations of this subspecies from the 2008 database, conservation team database, are shown in red here. And again, it's also found in isolated headwater regions. However, there are only 121 of these populations still on the landscape. And here again is the frequency of these different fragment lengths. As you can see again, the majority of these are found in shorter fragment lengths, and the median length is very comparable to the Colorado River cutthroat trout, and for Rio Grande, it's actually 5.9 kilometers. So like I mentioned before, we wanted to create a Bayesian network model to assess threats from climate change and other stressors for the Rio Grande cutthroat trout. This is the model we created along with my collaborators, and as you can see, it's much more complex. And one way we're able to do that is because there are only 121 of these Rio Grande cutthroat trout populations left, we're able to get a lot more detailed information for each of these populations and include more detailed kind of relationships between these influence nodes. But you can see there's some similarities between the Colorado River model. We have our two measures of stream temperature here. We have patch size or fragment length. Some interesting and important additions we included in this one included base flow discharge. We were able to develop a relationship between base flow discharge and cumulative drainage area, and that feeds into drought risk for these populations, and then also population connectivity, which includes the number of tributaries in a population or the presence of a lake. But broadly, we can kind of break this more complex model into three things, and again, we ran this at future time horizons, 2040 and 2080, and created a stream temperature model to drive those stream temperature model nodes that I'm showing you here. In those three categories, we can kind of break this new model into our genetic risks, population demographics, and stochastic disturbance risk. So they're, again, pretty similar to what we found and included in the Colorado River Cutthroat Trout model. However, we have a lot more detail in each one of these sections of the model. One specific example I'm just going to show you here is for genetic risks. Again, we have the adult population census and that ratio of effective to total population size. Then we also, one thing in addition we had for this subspecies is the proximity of a Rio Grande Cutthroat trout population to a source of non-native or hybridizing trout. And then we also have the presence of a barrier. And the barrier presence here is shown with a dotted line around it because that is a node that management agencies can actually control. So it gives them a little bit of a knob to turn if they want to use this as a tool to assess different conservation techniques. Some other details we were able to include in this version of the Bayesian network model included how non-native trout influence population size of these Rio Grande Cutthroat trout. So in total, we had 197 population estimates from these Rio Grande Cutthroat trout populations. 63 of these were graded 3 passes or greater, which actually allowed us to use that population estimate for that specific population to as input into our Bayesian network model. So we didn't have to use patch size or stream length to predict the total number of fish. However, when we didn't have these population, at least 2 of these population estimates, we did use a model, or basically a regression equation that predicted total number of Rio Grande Cutthroat trout fish greater than 75 millimeters from patch length. However, we're able to kind of parse this data set into 2 categories, allopatric populations, ones that didn't have any other trout in them, and sympatric populations, so populations that had non-native trout also in these segments with Rio Grande Cutthroat trout. As you can see here that when we had an allopatric population, there were more Rio Grande Cutthroat trout per kilometer than in a sympatric situation. So we're able to use more specific information for each one of these populations to predict the population size. And then we also created a stream temperature model. For this model, we had 544 records, so a little bit more, and we also used a more sophisticated stream temperature modeling technique, spatial stream network model. We use similar predictors. However, this one uses network distance, so the distance between points along the stream network versus just Euclidean distance, as was used for the Colorado River Cutthroat trout. And we were able to get a lower prediction error under 1 degree Celsius for the M30AT measure. Again, this is the southernmost subspecies, and as you can see here from these figures, the current thermal conditions are shown in black for the 2 different stream temperature metrics, and then those conditions in 2080 are shown in gray. As you can see, all of these are moving warmer, and then we actually have some of these, if you remember some of those thermal criteria, some of these temperatures that are getting very close to those, if not above them. However, the warming for the streams for the Rio Grande Cutthroat trout was actually lower overall. It was only 0.7 degrees C by 2080. For Colorado River Cutthroat trout, that was 1.1 degrees. But because these were found at such a southern latitude and probably closer to some of those upper thermal thresholds currently, 2.2 kilometers of these habitats became unsuitable, thermally unsuitable in 2080, and 11 populations had a reduction in survival due to just stream temperature alone, which is much more than one population actually that was really too warm for the Colorado River cutthroat trout. So we have these this new, more complex model, these predictions of current and future stream temperature, and we can plug them together and get, just like we did with the Colorado River cutthroat trout, predictions of population persistence. And so that's what we're showing here, what I'm showing here on this figure. The way we have this broken down is by barrier. So basically, how safe are these populations from being invaded by non-natives? Black bars indicate populations that have a complete barrier. Gray bars have a partial barrier. These hatched ones have no barrier, and white ones are currently invaded. So when we look at 2080, we see a pretty dramatic reduction in the probability of persistence for these populations across these 4 GMUs. So these are geographic management units. However, the populations that are still found having greater than 0.5 probability of persistence in 2080 all have a complete barrier on them. So you can see that that complete barrier is very important to the future persistence of Rio Grande cutthroat trout. So overall, 99% of these populations are at risk, meaning they have less than a 0.9 probability of persistence in 2080. 45 are extirpated. And like I said, intentional fragmentation is crucial for persistence. And to just drive that point home a little bit more, in 2080, the average probability of persistence for populations with a barrier is 0.66. With populations with no barrier is 0.08. So you can see having a barrier at the downstream end of your section, if you're for a Rio Grande cutthroat trout population, is very important for the probability of future persistence. So far, we've talked about 2 subspecies in streams. However, we know that cutthroat trout are not just found in streams, they're also found in mountain lakes. And lakes are important and unique. And here's some figures just showing how many lakes have cutthroat trout of these 3 subspecies, and then shown in parentheses are the number of conservation populations found in lakes for each of these 3 subspecies. One unique thing about lakes is the thermal habitat it provides. So this is some temperature data from 2 growing seasons and 1 overwinter season for 2 lakes containing Colorado River cutthroat trout. These lines represent different habitats. The gray line is the epilymnium of the lake, and so that's the upper component of the water column. White is the hypolymnium, or the bottom water of the water column in the lake, and yellow is the inlet stream. And these numbers are showing the M30 AT for each of these, for the epilymnium and the inlet stream for each of these 2 lake systems. As you can see, the epilymnium is much warmer and much more suitable than the inlet stream. And so both of these lakes are found at about 11,000 feet elevation, so pretty high, and the inlet streams are cold. And they're actually, both of these inlet streams are below that threshold of consistent recruitment, which is 8 degrees C. However, they both have very robust populations, and some of that is probably due to the warmer temperatures they have in these lake habitats. So, much more complex habitat thermally, and another unique component of these lakes is that they're remote. So that might prevent them from having higher incidence of non-native invasion if it's happening through illegal introduction. So we know cutthroat trout are found in these lakes. We know these lakes are unique. However, there's still a lot that's unknown about the ecology of cutthroat trout in these mountain lakes. So we performed a study looking at basically movement between mountain lakes and streams. And we use pit tags to do this. And so this is the movement basically of fish between a lake and a stream. So we had a reader right at the interface of an inlet stream and one of those lakes I showed earlier. And the yellow Dots in line here are showing upstream movement as represented by the proportion of annual movement, and gray is downstream movements, and these are related to the cumulative degree days. So as you might expect, upstream movements happen earlier than downstream movements, the majority of them, and a lot of those are related to spawning activities. These generally have, or in this system, these results are actually from that Clinton Gulch population. This system, the upstream peak happened at about 100 cumulative degree days, and the downstream peak happened at 190 cumulative degree days. So it appears that temperature is an important trigger or cue for these important life history events. And we probably wouldn't expect the cumulative degree days at which these peaks happen to change, but when that cumulative degree day happens in time could change with warming of these lakes and streams. So how are these lakes warming? Are they warming? To do this, we had 27 lakes, primarily in Rocky Mountain National Park and the Flat Tops Wilderness, with suitable continuous temperature to create models of surface temperature for these lakes. We used a nonlinear logistic approach. We predicted 4 metrics of stream temperature, and again, we used the downscaled regional climate models to do this. And these, the results shown in this map here are the M30AT, so again, that measure of the warmest 30 days in 2080 for each of these lakes, and then the circles are representing the total increase in ice-free days. So those are the days that a lake doesn't have ice on it or is above 4 degrees Celsius, the sum of those days for a year. As you can see here, some of these lakes are cold just like some of those streams. However, we do have some lakes which are a little bit too warm for consistent growth, and that's happening in Sand Beach Lake here in Rocky Mountain National Park and Spruce Lake, where they have an M30AT of 2080 in, of 19 and greater in 2080. So overall, these lakes are warming just like the streams are warming. And the rates across these 27 lakes, we're seeing an increase of about 1/4 degree per decade in the annual mean temperature, almost 1/2 degree per decade in summer mean temperature, and then an increase of almost 6 days per decade in that ice-free season, which is a drastic increase. It could actually mean more than a month more of ice-free days in 2080 for some of these lakes. And we really don't have a good handle on what that will mean for the ecology of these systems. If we relate this back to fish habitat, that metric of the warmest 30 days is increased by 2.9 degrees in 2080. So if you think back to what I presented for the stream temperatures and those increases, and 2 lakes are too warm in 2080, these lakes are increasing at greater rates than the streams. The streams in the upper Colorado River Basin were increasing in the M30AT temperature metric by 1.1 degrees Celsius in 2080, and the Rio Grande only increased by 0.7 degrees Celsius in 2080. So you can see that these lakes are warming, if you compare it to the streams for the Rio Grande Basin, at almost 3 times the amount in 2080. So that's a pretty big difference for some of these habitats that are very close to each other. So we know that lakes are important. Lakes are also warming, but there's a lot of influence of these lakes we still don't have a good handle on, and some of that could be the thermal influence of these lakes on streams downstream. And so a project that is just started last summer is investigating some of these questions for Rio Grande or greenback cutthroat trout in Rocky Mountain National Park. Within Rocky Mountain National Park, there are 27 populations of greenback cutthroat trout. We identified 98 existing temperature sites, and then we put out an additional 33, 20 in streams and 13 in lakes this past summer. A lot of the sample design was to really look at the influence of these lakes, not only how these lakes are warming, but also what's the influence on the streams downstream. And remember, 2 of these lakes were predicted to be too warm in 2080. So we also put some vertical arrays of temperature loggers in 3 of these lakes to look at not only how the surface temperature is changing, but how's that whole water column changing. And then we're going to create a Bayesian model of persistence specific to greenback cutthroat trout. So in summary, water temperature is changing, but at different rates. These rates are varying among subspecies and then also among habitat types. There's multiple stressors for cutthroat trout in the Southern Rocky Mountains. Some of the very important ones include non-native species, water temperature, stream flow, and stochastic disturbances. These last three are influenced by climate. The non-native species invasion is not. So what can we say about refuge habitat? Are there habitats that are that can serve as kind of refugia from some of these stressors, including non-native species, and then also climate-related stressors? One important thing would be that these habitats are free of non-native species and that they're going to continue to be free, so that there's a barrier preventing the upstream movement of non-native species. Larger fragment size is important, and then also the complexity of that habitat. More complex, probably higher quality of habitat for these populations. However, there's still a lot of things we don't know. Some future research needs could include more detailed population demographic studies, so we can include more life stages into our Bayesian network models to get a more realistic idea of how changes and stressors are influencing these populations. And then also specifically how stream flow is influencing those rates. Site-specific stream flow changes. A lot of these streams are so high up, they're in ungauged basins. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to look at how these changes in hydroclimate, which are also predicted with climate change, are going to influence the habitat and the habitat volume for these cutthroat trout populations. Also, how is climate change influencing habitat quality? How is secondary production, basically fish food, how well do these habitats grow fish food now, and is that going to change going into the future with these changes in stream flow and temperature? And then the importance of specific landscape features, which could be, targeted for conservation projects. One example of that would be lakes. That study I mentioned that just started for greenback cutthroat trout would kind of answer one of these questions. So, in conclusion, climate change is not the only threat for Southern Rocky Mountain cutthroat trout. The type of connectivity matters. Is this connectivity going to buffer populations against non-native invasions or not? Are there non-native fish there now? If you're going to add more connectivity but there's non-native fish there, that's really not going to increase your probability of persistence going into the future. And then connectivity that includes lake stream networks could be viewed as a good or a better strategy than just adding more stream length. Local population data allows a lot more detailed analysis, as evident in that Rio Grande Cutthroat trout example, and it also allows us to get a more mechanistic understanding of how these stressors are going to influence cutthroat trout in the Southern Rocky Mountains going into the future. And there's already examples, and so one big take-home from this group of studies is that complexity in these habitats is important, and it's also difficult to understand in some areas, but there's already examples of how conservation is using this idea or has been using this idea in embracing complexity. And some examples of that are reclamation projects for cutthroat trout, which are considering not only the current thermal regime, but also what that thermal regime might be in the future. So maybe streams that are a little bit too cold now, but are very close to that threshold of better recruitment and would probably reach it in the future. The distribution of non-native species and the barrier distribution, that was, the database we had we're able to use for Rio Grande Cutthroat trout, and the detailed information we had on how close these non-native species were to the cutthroat trout population was a great example of that. And then also efforts to increase the habitat heterogeneity. So not just adding, more single channel streams, but, connecting some of these close by basins when trying to identify areas for big reclamation projects going into the future. So overall, I think we've learned a lot through this research, and some of the surprising conclusions and results are, that temperature isn't the only major threat. It's just part of a suite of threats for these cutthroat trout populations, and that a lot of the management and conservation efforts that have been going on are addressing some of these, have been addressing and will continue to address some of these threats going into the future. So, like I mentioned, this was work that was done across many different projects. We had many different funding sources for this. Specifically today, I'd like to mention the Southern Rockies LCC, which helped fund the Rio Grande portion of this study, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, USGS Mendenhall Fellowship, Colorado State, Wyoming Game and Fish, and the Forest Service have all contributed funds to this area of research. And then I'd also lastly like to thank the conservation teams for the Colorado River Cutthroat Trout and the Rio Grande Cutthroat Trout. These are the groups of fish biologists and managers who are actually on the ground implementing these conservation strategies, and they are also the ones that are creating these databases which allow analyses like this that I presented you today. So I'd really like to thank them. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening to me. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will take any questions that you have. If you don't get to ask me a question while I'm on the phone here, here's my email address, and then also, as all current researchers do, I'm on Twitter, so you can follow me on there and at least keep updated on when I publish new papers. So thank you again, and I'll take any questions now that you have.
Thanks so much, James. Just a reminder to the audience, you can ask questions by typing them into the chat box and sending them to me, the host, or maybe it says science applications or the host. Send them to me and I'll read them to James, or you can ask questions through the phone. And we don't have any questions in the queue, so we'll give a minute so folks can formulate their questions. But I'd like to extend a invitation to the audience to ask a question via phone. And to ask a question through the phone, all you need to do is press *6 on your phone to unmute yourself, and then to unmute yourself, you would press *6 again when you're done asking your question or speaking. So I'd like to open up the phone lines if anybody's interested. Lori Martin, I know you have a group of folks with you. Do you have any, is anybody there have any questions? Again, just press *6 to unmute your phone. James, you got a compliment that says great work. Thank you. So we'll just wait a little bit more, give folks a chance to formulate questions.
Okay.
Hello?
Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Is that Lori?
Yeah.
Hi, Lori.
Can you hear us okay?
Yes.
Hi, this is Billy Atkinson. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. I got a microphone in one hand and the phone in the other. My question for Dr. Roberts is related to phytoplankton changes and algae changes that you might be witnessing in these high lakes. We've seen some lakes in some of the wilderness areas in my region that seem to be occurring a little more algae and phytoplankton in recent times. Is he looking at any of that component?
I don't have any current studies looking at that. When we went out to a lot of these lakes this past summer in Rocky Mountain, we tried to kind of keep an eye on that, for just kind of gross observable changes in algae blooms, but we didn't really have a good frame of reference. There is one good site where they have seen increases in benthic algae blooms in the park, and that's at Locks Vale. They have a cutthroat trout population there, but it's not pure. And there are some food web studies that are going on there to look at, you know, is all this production making its way into the food web, or is it just staying in that primary production thing, you know, stage, and not making it into secondary production through bugs and fish? I don't think we really have any good answers yet, especially for these high elevation lakes. But I do think that these temperature changes that we're seeing and predicting will influence those algae blooms like you've been seeing, Billy. And, you know, and that's not only from temperature, it's also from potentially from changes in nitrogen deposition from atmospheric sources as well. But, you know, we don't really have a good handle on how that's going to affect the fish populations in these lakes yet. And it could be two ways. It could influence, you know, how productive the lake and the secondary production is. It could also lead to hypolytic deoxygenation of that zone. If we just have a lot of this phytoplankton dying and going to the bottom and then getting consumed by microbes and using up the oxygen in that isolated hypolynium, it could lead to decreases in oxygen conditions. But again, there's a lot of speculation at this point. We don't have a good handle on exactly how all that is happening or will happen in the future. Good question, Billy.
Thank you. Good answer. Sorry.
Lori, are there any other questions from your group? Maybe not. Looks like they muted. Okay, I'm going to go. We've got a couple questions that were sent in. Was disease incorporated into the analyses?
Whirling disease was incorporated into the Rio Grande Cutthroat Trout analysis. That was one of the components in the demographic component of that Bayesian network model. And again, we're able to do that for Rio Grande Cutthroat Trout because we had much more detailed information on where whirling disease was already, and then also the type of non-native fish. So were there rainbow trout, were there carriers of whirling disease downstream of these cutthroat trout populations, and could they potentially carry it up into these cutthroat trout population components? So yes, it was included in the Rio Grande Cutthroat Trout analysis.
Thanks. The next question, wouldn't MWAT and DM be more relevant temperature measures to chronic and acute limits than 30-day measures?
Yes, the MWMT was used for the acute measures of survival. I gave that one example when we went through the Colorado River cutthroat trout, but that was also used as the survival metric for the Rio Grande cutthroat trout. But to get to levels of the MWMT that are actually lethal to these fish, it has to get very warm, and we saw very few, if any, habitats where cutthroat trout are currently found exceeding that threshold.
Thanks. So I'm going to open it up to anybody on the phone again. Just to ask a question by phone, all you need to do is press *6. All right. There are no takers on the phone call, and I don't have any more questions in the chat box. So unless someone pipes up quickly, I think we can go ahead and wrap it up. Oh, one more question came in. Did the model treat invasive species? Oops, let's see, that question went away. Grab it here again. Did the model treat invasive species and cutthroat evenly with respect to temperature?
Yeah, so we didn't have an interaction with temperature for the invasive species. So when we did the invasion for the Colorado River cutthroat trout, those invasion rates and incidents were completely independent of temperature. We did do a kind of a sensitivity analysis of those two rates, so like how common do invasions happen, and how quickly do they proceed once they do happen. You might expect with warmer temperatures, the rate of invasion proceeding forward might increase. You could kind of hypothesize about that, but the actual probability of persistence for cutthroat trout is influenced more by that, or is more sensitive to the incidence. So how common are these invasions on the landscape versus the rate of invasion once they do happen. So that is some evidence that temperature may not influence these invasions so much, but you know, as these fish are moving upstream, downstream of cutthroat trout habitat, and some of these areas might be warming and might be more suitable for rainbow trout or brown trout, you might be able to see something like that. But we just, you know, even though we did do very complex modeling and had some really great data sets, we didn't really have enough information to incorporate it that way into these models. But again, you know, that would be a good thing I should probably add to that future research needs. Good question.
We have another question that just came in. Did the model consider effects of food availability in terms of macroinvertebrates, food quality, as a result of increased temperature?
And no, it did not, and that's why, you know, that's a really important kind of future research need I put on that slide, because that could also change with these changing temperatures, but we don't really have a good handle on how that's happening at a broad scale in these Rocky Mountain lakes and streams.
Great. Well, that's it for the questions in the chat. If anybody wants to quickly ask a phone questions, please feel free to type in right now. In closing, James, do you have anything you want to say, or that you maybe forgot to say, or any future endeavors you want to just highlight?
I don't think so. I think you know, these slides will be available. Is that right, Mary?
That's correct. I'll post the slides with the recording next week sometime.
Yeah, so I think all the information is in there, and like I said before, if anyone, if any other questions pop up, or you want to get reprints of any of these papers I mentioned, feel free to email me and get those to you, no problem.
Okay, great. Well, James, thank you again so much for presenting, taking the time to do all this. And I'd also like to thank our audience for attending today's webinar. And as we said, we'll be posting, you should get it, I'll be sending everybody a link to the recording, and as well as those PDFs sometime early next week. So I just want to wish everybody have a great day, and enjoy your day, and hopefully we'll see you on our next webinar.
Yeah,
Bye.
and Mary, thanks for putting this all together. It was great. I really liked it.
Sure, thanks. You did a great job. All righty, take care, everyone.